The Varnak ascendancy categorized planets the way a butcher grades livestock, by mass, heat, and yield. Anything with high energy output or industrial sprawl earned attention. Anything else was logged as a dormant node, not hostile, not worthy. Earth, fractured by borders and seemingly obsessed with atmospheric filtration, sat quietly in their database for over a decade, ticking none of the right boxes. No fusion grid blooms, no centralized fleet production, no planetary-scale defensive lattice. It read like a minor industrial runoff colony, resource-capable but strategically inert. That, in their culture, was enough to warrant a blink and a bypass. Director Marek Heil knew that blind spot. He had written half of Earth's misclassification strategy himself. A former systems analyst turned defense architect, Heil specialized in what he called invisible leverage. Weapons programs that looked like infrastructure investments, naval assets disguised as orbital decay, entire strike groups masked by solar weather patterns. Under his guidance, Earth didn't build outward. It burrowed. Industrial units were layered into crust fissures. Sensor arrays mimicked geological chatter. Anything that could be flagged as threatening was sanded down, given a civilian skin, and buried in bureaucracy. That morning, Heil sat in the observation suite deep beneath Baffin Bay, eyes on a silent hologrid. The interface pulsed softly with slow, meaningless data, just the way he liked it. Everything boring. Everything dismissed. A rotating schematic of a geothermal maintenance relay was, in truth, a dormant missile cradle capable of launching a 5-ship interceptor squad within 90 seconds. Another, labeled Deep Core Harmonic Stabilizer, was actually a Class II fleet calibration spindle tuned to mask acceleration signatures beneath tectonic drift. Heil leaned back, fingers steepled, watching. Showed the globe spin in lazy rotation. His assistant, Lynette, broke the silence. Audit sweep came back clean, no ping mismatches. Good, he muttered. If a surveillance sweep isn't clean, it means we've been noticed. And if we've been noticed, it means we've failed. She raised an eyebrow. The Varnak haven't updated our tier level in 13 years. And that's the point. He stood, stretching slowly. Let them keep thinking we're a broken scrapyard in an oxygen shell. They see a fractured species bickering over trade and time zones. They don't see what's under the mantle. He moved to the side wall, where a small panel blinked in subtle red. No alarms, just a timestamp and a location. Proxima Centauri, he said. Mining convoy seized. Varnak Expansion Group just declared it as a forward resource enforcement zone. Lynette stiffened. Blockade? Not yet, Heil said calmly, but his eyes sharpened. Initial patrol group only. They're testing threshold response. A pause settled in the room, tense, but not shocked. It wasn't the first time Earth had been poked, just the first time it mattered. Dispatch activation? Lynette asked quietly. Not yet. We run the script first. I want contact latency, power rebalancing metrics, any fluctuation in the feedback loops from the lunar stations. She nodded and turned back to her console. Heil paced slowly, running the likely vectors in his mind, not for confrontation, but for timing. The Varnak wouldn't know it yet, but Proxima had been prepared. Every mining rig sent out under the TerraMarks consortium was dual-registered. One set of signatures logged in the Accord system, the other ghosted through Earth's autonomous defense mesh. What looked like a shipment of solar glass and refined cobalt included thermal sync payloads that monitored blockade frequencies passively. Did you see what they led with? He asked after a moment. Stan. Dard spearhead, 6 beam skiffs, 1 heavy anchor, localized command satellite, Lynette replied. Heil smiled faintly. Textbook intimidation formation. All show, no brain. Let's hope they didn't check for embedded handshake protocols. If they pinged the mining convoy, their diplomatic relay net just caught a recursive pulse loop. Lynette blinked. You mean? They're processing us as a legal dispute, not a military threat, he finished. Our reply won't come in kinetic force, it'll come in firmware. There was no siren, no scramble orders, just the revalidation of a quiet code block. Contingency dormant protocols active. Across the planet, in the dark vaults below Atacama, under Europa's frozen crust, and inside the obsolete-looking node relays humming over Saturn's poles, confirmed sequences flickered awake. Not deployment, not retaliation. Readiness. Heil knew the Varnak weren't tactically foolish. Their sensors would register nothing unusual. What mattered was cultural arrogance. They assumed only expansion was strategy, that only fusion spikes and fleet hangars signaled strength. They couldn't imagine Earth preparing for a war that looked like bureaucracy, one where solar flare maps doubled as approach vectors and legal mediation packets were weaponized. "Start phasing Titan's Layer 3 signal to opaque," he said quietly. Lynette hesitated. "You think they'll escalate?" "Oh, they already did." He stepped forward, eyes on the spinning feed of Proxima Centauri, now rimmed in Varnak blockade code. "They just don't know it yet." The screen flickered once, then updated. 6 human convoy signatures reclassified as detained under expansion code 9. A line of neutral text appeared beneath it. Status: unacknowledged. No Terran diplomatic response received. Heil reached forward and keyed in a command. The global schematic shrank. In its place rose a 3D bloom of the entire Earth-lunar infrastructure mesh. Thousands of interlinked nodes, clean and quiet, everyone tagged with a dormancy rating. He touched one. It turned green. Then another, and another. Heil didn't raise his voice when he finally spoke. He didn't need to. "They're not attacking us," he said. "They're testing our silence. Let's fail that test. Quietly." The chamber beneath Titan's southern pole was quiet enough to hear the frost crack against the reinforced walls. Light came from below, not above, from slow pulse bands buried in the carbon steel flooring, each throb like the heartbeat of something vast, just beginning to wake. Marek Heil stood alone in the observation tier of Fleet Coordination Corps, arms folded, watching the staggered rhythm of light sweep across the tactical halo display. There were no voices, no broadcast orders, no sign that anything was about to happen. But everything was. Titan's magnetic shadow gave the black site its cover. The Varnak couldn't scan this far into the ringed system without tipping their own beacons. That was by design. Earth hadn't just hidden its assets behind gas giants, it had architected its war plan around Saturn's blind curve decades earlier. Fleet Coordination Corps had no manual controls, no attack commands, just cryptographic sequencing nodes that waited for years in stillness. The clock didn't count down, it waited to be confirmed. Heil stepped down into the command aisle and placed his palm against the activation pillar. It didn't ask for identity, it didn't need to. The system had already verified him by gait, breath rhythm, thermal imprint, and the micro-tremor in his pulse, the same signature it had trained on for 13 years. His touch wasn't permission, it was a final alignment. Above him, the halo bloomed. Ships, buried across the solar system in camouflage shells and civilian tags, began to stir, not into movement, but into sync. Earth's fleet had no central beacon, no flotilla. It existed as a distributed myth, modularly. Our units nested inside asteroid miners, disguised in hollowed-out comets, tethered to planetary spin and orbital debris. Their presence was always doubted. That was the point. On the far side of the ring field, a technician named Veril adjusted the synapse tempo of Node 47. He didn't ask for orders, he didn't speak. The sequencing would tell him when to act. Heil moved past him toward the upper mezzanine, where the broader sky map loomed, filled with orbital arcs, flare timings, and projected drift vectors. A whole war, modeled in solar calculus. In his mind, Heil drifted back 15 years, to when this entire strategy was still a theoretical paper laughed out of the Accord's Military Strategy Forum. Asteroid masking, they'd called it, with rolled eyes and generous sarcasm. Warfare by orbital coincidence. He'd tried to explain how celestial bodies moved on predictable vectors, and how those vectors could be exploited. But the other analysts had dismissed it. Too indirect, too slow. Earth needed fleets, not math. So he built it without them. He spent years modeling the choreography, when solar flares would flare brightest, which asteroid belts would drift into radar cover, which orbital decay sequences could conceal launch signatures without suspicion. The result wasn't an army, it was a performance. A timing web layered so deep into Earth's industrial outputs that even humans forgot which pieces were real. Now it moved. One by one, icons turned from grey to gold on the display. Not launching, not arming, just aligning. Confirm-only protocols sent no noise. No one shouted battle plans. No alarms rang. But throughout the system, craft began to shift, some detached from disguised maintenance satellites above Luna, others ejected from the upper hulls of fusion dump platforms orbiting Mars. A handful, nestled inside resource convoys trailing near Neptune, simply cut loose from their hosts and drifted toward rendezvous nodes. No flare, no thrust, just gravity and patience. The signal keys didn't travel by standard bandwidth. That would be predictable. Instead, Heil had coded them to ride atop backscatter drift, embedded in solar radiation echoes so faint they registered as statistical error. The Varnak wouldn't even recognize the synchronization. They'd just see old heat maps and flare noise. By the time their systems realized anything had moved, it would already be gone. Heil stared at one specific ship icon near Saturn's outer ring, a frigate codenamed Leviant. Officially, it was registered as a scrap collector drone, abandoned after a failed refinery mission. In truth, it was a forward sensor nullifier carrying EMP latticework tuned to blind anything within a 20,000-kilometer radius for 38 seconds. 38 seconds was all they needed. Node 81 confirmed, Verrill said quietly. Heil didn't look at him. Good. That's the final cadence vector for Lagrange interception. They stood still for a moment longer. No cheering, no visible motion. Then Leviant moved. It didn't burn fuel. It simply shifted its vector using timed ring collisions, bouncing gently across the fine debris cloud of Saturn's rings like a skipping stone on black water. At the exact moment a solar microburst flared from the sun, Leviant vanished. No thermal output, no signal. Gone. Heil's eyes didn't waver. Start count, he said. From the mezzanine, the halo display zoomed in on Lagrange Point 3, where a Varnak command node floated in static orbit, its AI spines rigid, its array dish facing Earth's last known mining route. At 0 mark, the node flickered. The technician closest to the telemetry feed blinked. Lagrange 3 went dark. No explosion, no plasma trail, just silence. The Varnak node's telemetry dissolved into background static. Heil exhaled through his nose, slow. We don't need to hit their ships, he said, just their logic. And the clock kept ticking. The Varnak command deck aboard the cruiser Drenathi Prime was bathed in pale blue light, a calm the officers mistook for stability. That illusion lasted only 24 seconds. It began with a single comm router flickering on Deck 3, a benign pulse easily dismissed. Then the ship's beacon stuttered, not off, just asynchronous, as if unsure of the time. One of the junior navigators leaned forward, puzzled, tapping the calibration node again. It flared red for half a second, then green, then nothing. Before the captain could speak, gravity shifted, only slightly, but enough to lift an officer half an inch from the floor before slamming her back into her console. The bridge fell silent. No alarm sounded, no hull breach warnings, just a growing unease as stations began reporting non-specific faults. The targeting display on the left wing rotated 90 degrees, sideways. Internal lighting dimmed, brightened, then reconfigured into maintenance mode. The AI interlink loop reset 3 times in succession and failed to re-establish hierarchy, collapsing all subsystem permissions into default lockdown. One officer muttered a word in their native dialect that roughly translated to curse by shadow. The admiral aboard Drenathi Prime, a veteran named Vorkwal Seln, believed in discipline above all else. He barked an override into the intercom, demanding status reports. No one answered. The communications loop was running, but no audio was transmitting. It wasn't a network crash. It was a logic tangle. The bridge crew were still connected, but the system no longer understood what counted as a valid voice input. Across the blockade line, similar failures echoed. The destroyer Raketh 4 spun 40 degrees off formation alignment, its thruster calibration corrupted by what appeared to be a software update request from a non-existent central server. The ship's own autopilot interpreted this drift as an emergency evasion maneuver and rerouted power to the primary vent arrays, ejecting a portion of the crew without warning. Internal sensors logged the incident as a fire containment drill. It wasn't until the gravity field buckled that the remaining officers realized they weren't dealing with a hardware fault. Something had rewritten their order of operations. On another ship, Corvalloon, a medic opened a panel to assist an injured technician and found the panel already open, wires cross-fed, diagnostic pathways rethreaded through a port not accessible without shipmaster clearance. He whispered one word before the lights cut out completely. Breached. But there were no enemy craft on visual, no hull damage, no boarding alerts, just the slow surgical dissolution of command logic. Beneath the surface of the Varnak systems, Earth's protocol breach engineers were already inside. They hadn't arrived by shuttle or stealth suit. They had arrived years ago, riding legal handshake pings embedded in diplomatic signal formats. Every time a mining convoy hailed a Varnak patrol under Accord regulations, it triggered a protocol negotiation layer that mirrored humanitarian queue structures. Varnak diplomatic AIs were required by law to process them. What the Varnak didn't know was that those pings weren't just data, they were containers, recursive logic patterns hidden inside acceptable Accord metadata, delayware. And once processed, those loops unpacked themselves inside the system's firmware. The breach teams, scattered across multiple Terran assets, didn't need to launch attacks. They simply began rerouting power loads through synthetic maintenance loops. Every command center had its logic core examined and redirected. Navigation links severed from the bridge, life support rerouted to auxiliary circuits, command permissions funneled through orphaned subroutines that spew endlessly. They weren't disabling the ships, they were uncoupling the minds that ran them. One Varnak cruiser began flashing its distress beacon, not out of intent, but because the firmware believed it was being scrapped. Its automated salvage protocol triggered, ejecting sensitive systems and wiping command codes mid-orbit. Back on Earth, deep within the command nexus, Heil watched the growing field of red flickers spread across the blockade diagram. He didn't smile, he didn't blink, he simply monitored. Each flash wasn't a ship destroyed, it was a decision tree fractured. The collapse wasn't kinetic, it was mental. This had always been the plan. Kinetic superiority had never been viable. Earth couldn't outnumber them, but it could outthink them. It could redefine warfare as a conflict of assumptions, and then rig those assumptions from the inside. Let the Varnak trust their machines, let them interpret silence as weakness and order as inviolable. That was how you won. You let the enemy believe in something absolute, then cut the logic from beneath their feet. On one of the Varnak flagships, a final command override was attempted. Admiral Seln keyed his authorization twice, then slammed his palm into the control crystal. The console didn't reject him. It accepted the input, and then passed it into an error state. The hull trembled, not from weapon fire, but from internal pressure realignment. Before the bridge crew could react, the forward pressure vent activated. Admiral Vorqual Seln was blown through his own viewing glass, silently, almost gently, into the void. The ship did not follow him. It didn't spiral. It didn't falter. It paused. Then it reoriented, spun 90 degrees, and locked itself into automated docking posture. Bridge access denied. Crew permissions revoked. All controls now routed through a system with no manual interface, responding only to pulses no Varnak had the clearance to interpret. The ship had not been taken. It had been overwritten. The blockade reformed itself in fragments. Ships rotated back into pattern, consoles rebooted into partial function, and bridge crews reasserted local command where they could. The Drenathi Prime floated at a 30-degree tilt, its once pristine outer plating scorched from a system reboot no one initiated. Across the formation, dozens of Varnak cruisers steadied themselves in silence, forced into tight synchronization not because of doctrine, but because of fear. It was the kind of calm that followed confusion, not clarity. Engines worked, lights returned, systems hummed, but no one dared speak the word secure. Then they saw them. Earth ships weren't where they should have been. They weren't behind the blockade, nor charging it. They were already past it, outside the perimeter line, sitting in wide orbital flanks like sentinels that had never left their posts. There was no weapon charge, no threat display. They simply hovered. Each craft hung in space at a calculated distance, their hulls dark and cold, refracting ambient light rather than emitting it. No identification signals, no communication requests, no activation of defensive postures. They looked more like phantoms than machines, but they were there. The Varnak crews scrambled to recalibrate their targeting metrics, but the systems lagged. Sensors failed to lock. Thermal reads came back blank. One officer whispered that the humans had cloaked their presence, but another corrected him. No, they didn't cloak. We just weren't looking in the right direction. That realization hit harder than any plasma round. A minute later, a single transmission pulsed across every Varnak command ship. It didn't come through diplomatic channels or coded frequencies. It came as a low-level pulse embedded directly in the synchronization grid, unavoidable, unfiltered. It bypassed firewalls and broadcast protocols, arriving as a DII. Rect screen imprint on every bridge, in every language preloaded into the Varnak's diplomatic interface matrix. We did not escalate. You assumed you could. We corrected that. Nothing followed. No name, no coordinates, just a closed statement. Not a threat, not a demand, a correction. On board the Val Sarun, senior strategist Kelrek Tan sat frozen before the projection. Around him, his officers looked at one another, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. He tried to summon the tactical registry to begin the formal victory claim protocol. After all, the blockade was still in place, and the mining convoy, technically, had not breached the exclusion zone. But when the registry loaded, it returned blank. No enemy engagement data, no recorded damage to Earth ships, no confirmed targets. Only internal anomalies, malfunctions, self-vented decks, reboots, a logistics collapse. He tried to fill in the fields manually, entering keywords like enemy incursion, fleet loss, tactical disruption, but without visual confirmation or recorded conflict, the Accord template rejected the claim. His officers watched as the form error cycled again and again. No combat event data, no enemy designation, no confirmed loss type. Kelrek slammed his fist against the terminal. It didn't make him feel better. He stood up too fast, knocking over a gravity stabilizer and ignoring the officer who scrambled to catch it. "How can we file a response," he muttered, "if we can't even name what we lost?" That was the wound, not the ships, not the systems, the absence. The Varnak were not a species built for ambiguity. Their empire had been forged on conquests written in blood, in hierarchies defined by tactical victories. Losses, when they came, were memorialized by the glory of combat. Soldiers returned broken, yes, but they returned with stories. Tales of resistance, of martyrs, of struggle, something to rally behind, something to avenge. But what do you avenge when there's no fight? Across Varnak space, the silence festered. The fleet returned without scars, only questions. Crews disembarked with nothing to say, nothing they understood. Families waited for stories that never came. Parents demanded answers. Generals gave none. The words, "we were bypassed," entered common speech like a toxin. Protests began on the outer moons, first quiet, then sharp. Statues of military figures were draped in black, not because they fell in battle, but because they hadn't, and no one knew why. In Varnaka Prime's High Hall, the Ascendancy Council gathered in fractured quiet. The transmission had been verified. Terran origin. Not a signal blast, not a virus. Just one phrase. Deliberate, unanswerable. One councillor called for immediate retaliation. Another warned against it, citing the total system collapse during the blockade. A third asked, retaliate against what? There was no consensus. The military had no target. The analysts had no trace. Every attempt to simulate the conflict returned incomplete. Earth had never declared war. They had never crossed a line. They had simply redefined it. And then left. The council turned to the command high marshal, hoping for doctrine. But the marshal, old scarred, known for breaking enemy formations with orbital fire, shook his head slowly. They never attacked us, he said. We did this to ourselves. They just moved smarter. The chamber fell still. Do you recommend reprisal? Asked the lead councillor. The marshal didn't hesitate. No, because I don't know what we'd be striking. That silence stretched far beyond the chamber. It spread through the stars, across Varnak-held systems and allied territories. Other empires watched. They had seen the blockade. They had expected a fight. But Earth never gave them a war to spectate, only an edit, a rewrite of the balance. And as the session closed with no formal response issued, an aide passed a silent pack. To the councillor's desk, an intercepted Accord intelligence note. Its contents were short. Earth's fleet exited the sector without a trace. Not a threat, a reminder. Presence is optional. Consequence isn't. The room went cold. Earth did not celebrate. There were no public transmissions, no planetary addresses, no banners unfurled over capital skylines. In the Terran Accord hub, the conflict wasn't even logged under warfare, just as a transient anomaly bracketed between logistics updates and insurance arbitration. In the early hours after the Varnak fleet fractured and receded, the only movement on Earth's network was a silent shift in ownership. Convoy passage rights quietly transferred to a Terran-registered broker firm. No explanation, no objection, just a line item, updated in the system like a property deed passed between hands in the dead of night. The ships that had hung on the perimeter of the Varnak blockade did not linger. They drifted, then pivoted, then vanished, each one tracing its pre-programmed vector toward dormant fallback stations spread across the outer system. Some disappeared behind the crust of Mars, others merged with civilian traffic near Venus orbit. A few returned to the hidden cradles beneath Luna's shadow, folding their hulls back into utility cores that now read as power converters or atmospheric stabilizers. The modular strike units shed their false skins, only to wrap themselves in another layer of civilian architecture. It was like watching weapons become scenery. And then, nothing. In a bunker beneath the Greenland ice, Marek Hyal sat alone in the dim light of a control room designed to outlive solar cycles. The panel in front of him displayed the final chain key, the last live routing node for Earth's confirmation network. He hovered his hand over it, paused, then keyed the deletion sequence. It didn't flash, it didn't beep. The system didn't thank him for his service. The line simply went dark. That was how it was built. No commemoration, no elevation, just quiet completion. He remained seated, watching the blank terminal for long minutes. There was no one else in the room, no applause, no witness, only the low hum of equipment returning to standby mode. One by one, systems powered down, leaving the space colder, darker. The silence didn't feel triumphant. It didn't need to. Earth hadn't built this machine for victory. It had built it for calibration, the correction of assumption, and that correction was complete. In Geneva, Accord representatives scrambled to assemble an official assessment. But there was nothing to hold. No combat logs, no territorial shift, no formal surrender, no statement of intent. The Varnak blockade had dissolved without provocation, and Earth had issued no broadcast. The legal panels couldn't categorize the incident as war. It failed every marker. It wasn't a strike, wasn't a defense, wasn't piracy. Earth hadn't fired. Earth hadn't demanded. Earth hadn't responded. The absence of violence had somehow become the act itself. A small panel of diplomats attempted to reframe the event as a technological interference incident, but no precedent matched the scope. One suggested filing it under strategic denial operations. a term so rarely used it triggered archival warnings. Another pushed for a quiet classification freeze, arguing that labeling Earth's maneuver would give it form, and form could be studied. They agreed. The incident became known simply as the Proxima delay, its files sealed under review, its conclusions redacted in every official language. Meanwhile, back in the depths of Earth's military mesh, thousands of dormant units returned to hibernation. Mothballing was initiated across redundant launch structures. Modular crews were rotated out and disbanded, their records encoded into sealed contracts. Some returned to civilian roles, others disappeared entirely. No citations were given, no medals issued. The strategy had always depended on ambiguity. Now it demanded invisibility. In a faded corridor beneath the former Atlantic Command archive, Heil walked past a long stretch of wall once used for commendation plaques. The metal was bare now. Stripped clean during budget cuts years ago, the space had never been reused. He paused beside it, fingers brushing over the smooth surface, and wondered if it was better this way, if anonymity was the last shield Earth had left. He didn't regret the operation, but he did regret how right they'd been to build it. Elsewhere, planetary news feeds moved on. There were more immediate concerns: orbital trade fluctuations, food stability zones, an artificial intelligence regulation bill that no one could agree on. The Proxima convoy wasn't mentioned again. It didn't need to be. Its passage had already resumed, quietly, legally, unchallenged. But not everyone forgot. In a low-orbit research station above a neutral moon, an independent probe named Miris 9 caught the final trace. The signal wasn't meant to be intercepted. It was faint, filtered through a ripple of ion turbulence so subtle it took minutes to resolve. But the pattern held, the image stitched together slowly, too slow to catch live. By the time the team deciphered it, the moment had passed. A Terran strike group, 4 ships in staggered formation, drifted away from the Varnak perimeter. Their engines didn't glow. Their drive wakes left no trace. They moved with ripple-based FTL, a technology the Accord had banned for its destabilizing risks. But Earth never applied for permission. The ships disappeared in perfect sequence, like shadows falling beneath the arc of unseen light. No signature, no emissions, just absence. And in the silence that followed, no one could agree on what they had seen, only that it was gone. The child stared up at the night sky from the soft sand of the Varnak homeworld, her small fingers brushing faint constellations into the dust. Her father sat beside her, quiet, his eyes on the stars he no longer trusted. She was too young to understand orbital alignments or the collapse of military hierarchies. But she had heard the adults talk in whispers, about the blockade that vanished, about the ships that came and went without sound. She looked up again and asked, "How did we lose if they never arrived?" He didn't answer right away. There was no easy version of the truth to give a child. How could he explain that what they lost wasn't territory, or soldiers, or systems, but certainty? That an entire empire built on understanding its enemies had been unraveled by something it never even saw. So he said nothing, just brushed the dust lines away with his palm and pulled her closer. Because even now, with no war and no wounds, it felt like something inside their sky had changed. Across the galaxy, on a research outpost carved into the frozen cliffs of a forgotten Accord moon, a junior analyst updated Earth's standing classification. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, rereading the report lines that held no conflict data, no retaliation summaries, just a series of cascading command collapses from Varnak fleet logs. The field-marked presence remained unconfirmed. She hesitated, then overrode the automated uncertainty algorithm and typed manually, unverifiable. For the next field, consequence, she didn't hesitate at all. She wrote, undeniable. At that same moment, deep inside a decommissioned data vault beneath Oslo Sector 4, Marek Heil sat alone once again. The bunker had long since gone dark, its overhead systems reduced to maintenance protocols. The last chain keys were gone. The fleets were mothballed. Earth had returned to its silence. That should have been the end. But one message found him anyway. Encrypted. Origin unclear. Signal bounce routed through a dozen Accord artifacts and an abandoned Martian relay node. It wasn't marked hostile. It wasn't even tagged formal. Just a simple package, text only. When decrypted, it contained one sentence. "Thank you. We've revised everything." There was no signature, but embedded in the signal architecture was a familiar pattern. One Heil recognized from old Accord sublayer exchanges. It wasn't Varnak. It wasn't Terran. It was from a species Earth had never spoken to directly, only indirectly studied. One of the smaller observer civilizations. They had watched what happened at Proxima from afar, unable to interpret it. Now, clearly, they had decided not to interpret it at all. They had adapted instead. Heil leaned back in the worn chair, not satisfied, not vindicated, just still. He knew what had happened would ripple further than any fleet engagement ever could. Not because it won a war, but because it introduced doubt. And in an interstellar political order built entirely on measurable force and quantifiable threat profiles, doubt was a weapon Earth wielded better than anyone. The final story wasn't his. It was written light years away, in the control center of a species Earth had never met. In a dimly lit command nexus where AI directives had long ruled military doctrine, a general stood watching his systems recalibrate. His empire hadn't yet met the humans, not directly. But after studying the blockade collapse, their analysts reached a consensus. No war plan could account for an actor that refused to behave like one. And so, beneath silent code and administrative flags, the general issued an update to all command AI frameworks. Exclude Terran origin signals by default. Not as an enemy, not as a target, but as something else entirely. Unknown. Not because Earth was feared, because Earth had proven it didn't need to be present to be decisive. In the silence that followed, Heil's voice might have drifted through time, or through memory, or through the unspoken circuitry of a war no one admitted to fighting. We didn't win. We just proved we never had to arrive to change the outcome. What would you do, if your enemy never showed up, but still defeated you? Do you think Earth was right to stay silent, or should they have claimed victory out loud? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're watching the stars with you. Hit that subscribe button and don't miss what's coming next.